This round we have two presentations in the same session. So what we'll do is Nate will start with his presentation for 20 minutes, and then we can ask a few questions. And then Diego will do the next 20 minutes, and we'll ask a few questions. And then I'll ask you to leave the room, and the panel will sit down here and discuss cases and make recommendations. Okay. All right. All good now. Nate, it's yours.
Oh, ready? Teresa's there. Can you see me?
Teresa!
Can you hear me?
Teresa? Okay.
You can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Very good.
Just
Awesome.
need to talk a little bit louder.
Oh, okay. Okay. I'll yell the presentation.
Can we move closer?
I think it's connected to the Wi-Fi.
Yeah, it's really good.
Ready?
Yeah.
So, my name's Nate. You haven't met me before. And this is my final year review presentation. So first I'd like to thank my supervisory panel, Chris and Teresa, and the review panel, Phil, Joe, and Alex. Thanks for coming, and everybody. Thanks for coming to all of you. So today I'm going to talk to you about two studies from my thesis titled Physical Activity for Youth with Intellectual Disabilities, an analysis of the determinants and the outcomes. Cool. So, I don't know if you all have heard this or not, but physical activity is amazing! It's also a magic pill, okay? For typically developing...
I would know.
It's a magic pill. For typically developing adolescents, increased physical activity is associated with a higher quality of life, lower risk of disease, higher levels of psychological and emotional well-being, greater school engagement, greater motor control, motor skills, more frequent pro-social behaviors, and enhanced self-concept. Amazing. Now, here's a group of students with intellectual disabilities. I can't tell you their names because, you know, ethics, confidentiality. Let's just call them the Two Live Crew. Apparently, these guys aren't getting the magic pill. Compared to their typically developing peers, these guys are going to be less physically fit, more overweight, 3 times more likely to present with clinical levels of anxiety, and twice as likely to present with experienced depression. Not good. Not good at all. So we need to do something about this. Unfortunately, the research tells us we don't know enough. No.
Who's going to need it?
Are you good, Teresa?
I can hear you with
Okay.
a couple of interruptions, but it's fine.
Okay. So the research tells us that we need more information. Okay. That's where my thesis comes in. And that starts with a systematic review and a meta-analyses, looking at the effects of physical activity on the physical and the psychosocial health of youth with intellectual disabilities. So the goal of this study was, first, summarize the current research. Next, highlight the effects of physical activity on the physical and the psychosocial health of these adolescents. And then finally, explore potential moderator variables related to study and participant characteristics. So, started with around 2,400 articles, and ended with 109. 80 of those studies only looked at physical health outcomes. 14 of them looked at only psychosocial outcomes, and 15 looked at both the physical and the psychosocial outcomes in the same study. These studies were separated into 2 meta-analyses. One looking at the physical health benefits of physical activity, what those look like, and the other meta-analysis looking at the psychosocial health benefits. Got it? So, for the review of the studies looking at physical health, we can see that most of the studies in this review had pre-post control designs or single group pre-post designs. About 2/3 of the studies had participants who were adolescents with mild levels of intellectual disability, And about half of the studies included participants with other developmental disabilities like autism, Down syndrome, Prader-Willi syndrome, stuff like that. Interestingly, a large portion of these studies didn't report the specific levels of intellectual disability or whether the participants had developmental disabilities or not. For the review of the psychosocial health benefits, most of those studies had a pre-post control design, and about 2/3 of the participants were adolescents. Those adolescents had either mild or mild and moderate intellectual disabilities, and this last chart's interesting because almost 2/3 of the studies in this review didn't report whether the participants had developmental disabilities or not. And that's a big deal because if we're looking at psychosocial health, especially kids with autism, they have a hard time socializing or participating in physical activities that might be more social. So that's something that we should probably look at in the future. So, what are the effects of physical activity on physical health and psychosocial health? Well, based on the 3-level random effects meta-analysis, we can see that physical activity had moderate to large effects on physical health outcomes and moderate effects on psychosocial health outcomes. Pretty cool. Now, this comes with a large amount of heterogeneity, as you can see. So that means we get to look at potential moderators that might explain some of this variance. And so that's what I'll do now. I'll go through some of the significant moderators in these meta-analyses. So for the studies looking at physical health outcomes, age category was a significant moderator. And as you can see, children saw the largest effects, physical activity. Physical health outcome type was another significant moderator. And as you can see, flexibility had the largest effects, while physiology had the smallest. And physiology is things like BMI, blood lipid levels, body fat percentage, stuff like that. Pretty interesting. In the psychosocial health meta-analysis, you can see that study design was a significant moderator, and that the studies with repeated measures had much smaller effects than the studies with a single time point measure. Psychosocial health outcome type was a significant moderator here. And you can see that the behavioral outcomes were much larger than the rest.
What's behavioral psychosocial health?
Behavioral things like classroom behaviors.
Oh, so not acting out.
trouble. Yeah, not acting out, exactly. And then that one was followed by, behavioral outcomes were followed by psychological outcomes, which are things like mental health, self-esteem, self-concept, stuff like that. And social outcomes, friendships, and interactions. Cool. And then finally, in the psychosocial health meta-analysis, intervention type was a significant moderator. And you can see from this that movement and sports skills training had a much larger effect than general physical activity or physical education did. So, what does all this mean? Well, first, that physical activity has a positive impact on physical and the psychosocial health of adolescents with, or youth with intellectual disabilities, not just adolescents, children too. For the physical health outcomes, you can expect to see the biggest changes in flexibility and the smallest changes in physiology, as I said before. And to see the biggest improvements in psychosocial health, you should probably favor sport and movement skills training over general physical activity or physical education. And then finally, for physical educators, they can expect to see improvements in both the physical and psychosocial health, but expect bigger improvements in physical health. So, back to the 2 Live crew. Look, study 1 tells us that if these guys are given the proper guidance, proper opportunities to be physically active, we'll see benefits. Okay, but that may not necessarily be the real world. In the real world, these guys have limited opportunities to participate in physical activity. They have a hard time participating in autonomous forms of physical activity. So what we need to do is we need to look at the drivers, determinants of physical activity, and what role it plays in them seeing these benefits. That's where study 2 comes in. So, I hypothesize that the determinants of physical activity, intrinsic motives to be physically active, and physical ability self-concept, and the outcomes of physical activity, cardiovascular fitness and worries, are mediated by physical activity. Determinants, physical activity, behavior, and outcome. Makes sense. And I'll test that hypothesis with this beautiful longitudinal mediation model. Let you look at that for a sec. It's beautiful.
I'll say that was you.
So, for physical activity to be a mediator in this model, physical ability self-concept and intrinsic motives will need to predict physical activity, subsequent physical activity. Physical activity will also need to predict subsequent cardiovascular fitness and worries. And finally, the determinants of physical activity, you can see there, at baseline, we need to predict the outcomes of physical activity at time 2 when controlling for physical activity. So how do we measure all these things? Well, self-reported physical activity was measured just by asking the kids, last week, which days did you practice sport? Physical ability self-concept was a subscale of Herb's self-description questionnaire. Intrinsic motives for physical activity is a subscale of Rich's motives for physical activity measure. Cardiovascular fitness was measured with the 6-minute walk test, and worries was a subscale of the global anxiety scale, ID version. All the questionnaires were adapted to the cognitive level of the students, and you can see here there's an example of one of the questions from the questionnaire. So, results, preliminary results. 252 students at baseline with intellectual disabilities. They had mild or moderate levels of intellectual disability and an average age of about 15 years old. They also reported super low levels of physical activity. This is days per week here, and looking at around 3 days per week of physical activity, that's not anywhere close to the recommended 60 minutes of daily physical activity for adolescents. Not close. Back to this beautiful mediation, longitudinal mediation model. But before we test that, we got to look at the measurement model and the invariance of the measurement model. That was tested through longitudinal invariance testing, and it looks to be fairly stable. Here are the correlations between the variables. We have intrinsic motives and physical ability self-concept are highly correlated. Those are the determinants, and they're also correlated to a lesser extent with physical activity. So results. Here are the significant paths of that longitudinal mediation model. Now let me break this down just a little bit.
Could I ask how is cardiovascular fitness measured?
6-minute walk test. So they walk back and forth for 6 minutes between 2 cones.
Yep.
So let me break these down.
Sorry, one more question. What's the time difference between baseline and time one?
Just a year. Every year we measure.
Is this a control condition of a larger study?
This
It's
is
just
the,
lots
this
of
is the,
different-
yeah,
So why would you call it
longitudinal.
baseline here?
Okay. Got it.
So, looks like the effects are mostly stable across time.
I don't know, that sounds like low testing test, reliability of the fitness test.
And the only other significant effect is physical ability self-concept at time 1, predicting self-reported physical activity at time 2. So what does this mean? Here are the conclusions that I drew from this. In this study, it seems that self-reported physical activity may not be a mediator between the determinants and the outcomes. With the high correlations between the intrinsic motives and physical ability self-concept, but them not really predicting physical activity, the determinants not predicting the behavior, this could suggest that we're seeing positive illusory bias, which is basically a mechanism that these kids might use to protect their self-esteem by inflating their beliefs about themselves. Their confidence, their self-concept. And then the final conclusion is that maybe these physical activity levels were just too low for these kids to see the benefits of physical activity. So, some overall conclusions of these two studies. In the meta-analysis, we saw that physical activity did have an effect on health for these kids. In the empirical study, we didn't. So the difference is intervention versus observation. In the meta-analysis, these kids were given the opportunities to participate, they were guided through it, and they weren't given that opportunity, well, they weren't provided with that opportunity in the empirical study. Okay, so that could suggest that if they're not given these opportunities, then these kids might not participate in physical activity. Also, these kids need to be more active than 3 times per week to see the benefits. And finally, I think giving these kids the opportunity to participate in physical activity, it might be the most important thing for them to gain the benefits of physical activity and taking the magic pill. So, there are all my references for the presentation. And that's it. You got any comments, questions, concerns about any of that?
Questions?
On the meta-analysis, did you find that the study design was only a significant moderator for the psychosocial variables and not for the health-related?
No, yeah, not for the health. I think I have the whole table.
No, you don't need to.
Oh,
show
yeah, there's
Yeah.
study design not significant.
But that's quite interesting. Why do you think that was?
That's a good question.
I mean, I would have expected it to be significant for both of them. Usually you find pre-post, particularly when it's an area where a lot of the research is a little shoddy, you'd expect the pre-post to be positively biased relative to the intervention one.
Yeah, you would expect that. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah, think about that.
In your reciprocal effect models, just in study 2, what was the sample size?
252 baseline.
Could you go back to that, actually,
But there was no intervention.
No intervention.
Oh, that, no, go, that one, yeah, no.
No, keep going.
There,
This
okay.
one. No, that one.
Beautiful one, the actual, no, the actual.
Oh, the model?
The model with
Your
the.
model.
Oh, my beautiful longitudinal
There,
mediation
the
model.
effect, let's see, the effects of, could you show me what the effect was again?
Yeah.
Well, just one forward.
No, it's
Two,
later.
3, oh.
I'm sorry.
It was so close. There
This
it is.
one.
Okay. So they felt stronger, they increased the extent that they were more active.
From this, I mean, we're measuring something. That's for sure, because it's stable.
It's so
There's effects.
stable.
We just, yeah.
They just thought that they were doing more activity, but they weren't in fact.
Which, well, they were.
Why are the stability coefficients not there for cardiovascular? Is that just?
Not significant.
Really?
Yeah. For
Really?
For between time 1 and time 2.
Wow.
Were they at a similar level then?
Yeah, yeah. I have, that's, where is that? That's here. I guess they went down pretty much, 2 or 3.
In your meta-analysis, did you, what was the, was there enough variation in dose? Was there much of a dose-response effect?
There was, and I actually did have that. And
No effect?
I did look at it. No, there wasn't anything there. But that's a tough one for dose because it could be all the way out, or it could just be a very short intervention.
I would think that would make it easier if there's that big a range.
That's true. That's true.
Well, it's complicated to
No.
get a handle on it,
Yeah.
because, you know, there's the amount of time, there's the amount of time, the number of sessions, the amount of time in each session, how long it is.
And they're not
so
measuring everything in every study, are they? Because MEPS would be the standardized version, whatever they do, the amount of effort. There's a kind of common metric there, but
Yeah.
you couldn't infer that. Yeah.
You were saying that there was, you were surprised that there wasn't, or you didn't find changes in BMI kind of measures in the meta-analysis, but those would mostly be relatively short-term interventions, and even if you did change the physical activity, you probably wouldn't see those sorts of measures changing that quickly.
Yeah. I guess especially in adolescence as well.
Yeah.
You know, I think that,
Well, and exercise has a notoriously weak effect on weight. It just doesn't do it. Nutrition.
but there are some studies that that support that BMI and body fat percentage doesn't change a whole lot.
Am I reading that right, that the fitness actually went down from year 1 to year 3, so that there's 60? So is that a case of selection effect? So are they more fit kids not continuing in the study, or what's going on there?
I would, so,
You would expect
From-
the opposite.
well, yeah, you would expect the opposite, but from year 1, from the baseline to year 2, the older kids graduated and they weren't tracked. So,
So there is a selection,
yeah,
but
I
it's
guess
an
yeah,
age
there must be
selection.
age selection, yeah, the older kids probably might do a little bit better. Yes, sir.
So when you say that there wasn't an effect on the physiological measurements, so what it's not clear to me what you did. So you meta-analyzed like BMI, body fat, and different types of
I put them
all together.
into categories, I did all together. I did separate out BMI by itself.
They're very different measurements, so you can't probably expect any effect on that because they measure different things. So I don't know which one do you have.
Yeah, there are a lot of
Makes
different.
sense that you don't find anything.
It wasn't that you didn't find anything.
Well, I didn't. So the effects were still moderate, 0.5. So there was an effect. It just wasn't as big as the other ones.
And you did look at some of the sort of sub-variables within that.
I separated out BMI. It was all about the same.
I mean, I think it's difficult. I mean, you had something like 70 or 80 different outcome variables, so you have to sort of group them in some way.
Do you put the effect size in the final plot to see the effect of small studies versus large studies?
Yeah. I didn't talk about that, but I did see that there were small study effects.
Yeah. You
In
would
here.
expect that.
And yeah, it was.
I think that's important.
And I did an adjustment for that as well, and it did. It did happen. Huh?
Congratulations.
Alex, just in the interest of time, should we
Yeah.
move on?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, happy with that.
All right. Thank you very much. We wish we would have more time to more discussions. That is interesting. But we have two in a row. So next one is Diego.
Usually it's most things
We're going to tax autonomy and behavior.
All right, Diego.
Okay.
I knew you'd know.
All right.
Hey everyone, so just like Nate, I'm presenting my final year review, and first of all, I wanted to thank my supervisors, Chris and Phil, and the review panel, Alex, Joseph, and Teresa. And I'm going to be talking about what I've done since my confirmation of candidature, so 2 years and something ago. And my presentation is entitled Relationship Between Teachers' Interpersonal Style and Student Outcomes in Physical Education. So what I'm going to be talking about is pretty much about people's behavior and quality of the relationships. So the way people interact with other people in general life, but specifically in physical education. How the teacher interact with their students. According to SDT, this relationship or this behavior from the teacher can be seen as autonomy supported when the teacher provides choices and options, attitudes and ideas, or they provide rationale for the tasks. When they provide the structure in the lesson, like treating students fairly, providing adequate help, or monitoring this lesson, and when they show involvement by showing affection, attunement, and dependability. Some examples of those behaviors. So autonomy support is very similar to supporting students' autonomy. The need for autonomy, the structure is similar or almost the same as supporting students' competence. Need feelings of competence and involvement refers to satisfying students' relatedness. In contrast, when sometimes teachers can engage in controlling behavior by using pressuring language, extrinsic rewards, or negative expressions. And this has to do with the frustration of students' psychological needs. Well, according to SDT, so this is the motivational process, and as you can see here, the student outcomes or positive outcomes, they are predicted by social context, and it should be, or it is expected to be mediated by need satisfaction and motivation. So it is hypothesized that those are mediators of that process, that relationship between teachers or peers and students' outcomes. And research has shown that some consequences associated with teacher behavior or the support from the teacher, like effort, it is positively associated with levels of physical activity, intentions to engage in physical activity, and affective consequences or outcomes like enjoyment are associated with positive satisfaction with the lesson, more leisure time physical activity behavior, and intentions to engage in physical activity as well. So the incentive for cognition, higher in-class physical activity behavior, effort and persistence, participation in and performance in PE, and negatively associated with negative effect. So my research question is, what's the effect of need support from the teacher on primary school students' outcomes in PE? And the way this thesis is designed, is in I separated it into 2 phases. Phase 1 was a systematic review and a meta-analysis, and phase 2, I'm looking at an intervention with dependent variables determined by results of the systematic review. As you can see here, and I guess most of you know that systematic review is a large, huge portion of places. And okay. So this meta-analysis, what I did, I examined the evidence regarding the tenets of SDT within the PE context. So it has been submitted to educational psychologists, and I got a revise and resubmit outcome, which is good. And aiming to resubmit by the end of the month. So fingers crossed. Yeah. Well, I searched for electronic databases for the studies. Yeah, so these are before that I searched it for. Looking at papers published in English, looking that had the sample with children or adolescents, of course in the PE lesson context, and any relationship between the SDT constructs and PE outcomes. Using systematic combinations of 2 groups of keywords, like autonomy support and autonomous motivation, and yeah, so on and so forth. Then, yeah, use EndNote for the titles and abstract and full text screening, and all that process was double checked by at least 1 person. And same for the data collection, and that wasn't me, but it's
That was Chris.
Yeah, so descriptive info and the SDT variables, the outcomes, and of course statistical results within each paper. And again, at least 1 person double checked the data that was extracted. And from almost 16,000 records, I ended up with 605 eligible for screening, full text screening, and this qualitative synthesis included 265 studies, and the meta-analysis were included 252 in the meta-analysis. That's why it was, yeah, you can see. So, made a moderation analysis using multi-level structural equation modeling approach, only using cross-sectional data, even for experimental studies and longitudinal studies. And then I explored heterogeneity by looking at I-squared values when they were above 0.25 to see if there was any if those variables could explain differences in effect sizes. So sex, age, culture, risk of bias within studies. And another purpose of the meta-analysis was to test the SDT motivational sequence, which proposes that social context predicts need satisfaction, which in turn predicts motivation, and leads to positive or desirable consequences. I tested that the SDT motivational sequence I compared it against a dual process model, which has been proposed by researchers recently, I mean, not so recently, but when it separates the positive or the bright side and the negative or the dark side of the SDT constructs. So teacher support would lead to adaptive outcomes, and controlling behavior would lead or explain maladaptive outcomes, mediated by needs satisfaction or frustration and the different motivation constructs. And I also tested a single mediation model by excluding motivation variables to see whether that model could explain student outcomes better than the full sequence. So in that model, student outcomes are predicted by social context, but only mediated only by need satisfaction. Okay, so results. The review portion says that there's the evidence in PE regarding structure or competence support and involvement or relatedness support is scarce, and cognitive outcomes have been studied much less than effective and behavioral outcomes, and most research has been conducted with older children and adolescents, and less attention has been paid to younger children, so primary school students. Okay, so 319 meta-analyses, approximately 6,500 effect sizes were analyzed, of which of the 319 meta-analyses, 57 were strong, 127 moderate, 124 weak, and 11 very weak. So, okay, and as we can see here, need support. Positively associated with need satisfaction, so autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And interesting, peer support is more strongly associated with relatedness than support from the teacher. And again, teacher support and peer support, correlations with motivation constructs. We can see that need support is positively correlated, associated with autonomous motivation, and negatively associated with external and A motivation, but positively associated with introjected regulation. So support from both the teacher and peers showed positive association with introjected regulation. And teacher support and outcomes, need support and outcomes, as we would expect, positively associated with adaptive and negatively associated with maladaptive outcomes. Need satisfaction variables, psychological needs, positively associated with autonomous motivation, which includes, sorry, I forgot to mention, intrinsic motivation and identified and integrated. So it's a combination of those three. And negatively associated with external regulation and A motivation. And again, introjected regulation was positively associated with autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Okay, and with the outcomes, same pattern as before. Need satisfaction, showing positive associations with adaptive outcomes and negative associations with maladaptive outcomes. And then the last ones, motivation, autonomous motivation with adaptive outcomes, and not controlled, but external and A motivation, negatively associated with maladaptive outcomes, but again, introjected regulation, positively associated with both adaptive and maladaptive, which is not surprising, but we would expect that introjected regulation would be negatively associated with maladaptive outcomes, but since this is use only cross-sectional data, baseline data from every study, students can be motivated by introjected reasons. So it is a way to get them to do something. That's what cross-sectional data showed. And the moderators I tested, they all helped to explain some of the heterogeneity found in effect sizes. For example, sex explained some of the heterogeneity or the differences in the effect sizes on the relationship between autonomy and competence, introjected regulation and A motivation, and introjected regulation and adaptive outcomes. Age explained some of the heterogeneity or differences on the relationship between introjected regulation and adaptive outcomes. And stronger effect sizes were found for individualistic students from individualistic countries on the relationship between autonomy and external regulation and relatedness and external regulation. And for students from collectivist countries or collectivist-oriented cultures, stronger effect sizes were found on those associations. Okay, and before showing you the results of the path analysis, here are the fit indices, the comparison among the fit indices, which showed the SDT motivational sequence to be the best model to analyze that data, and that's what I did. So, as you can see here, support from the teacher is a stronger predictor of autonomy, students' autonomy and competence, but support from peers is a stronger predictor of students' relatedness than support from the teacher. And all the paths here are significant. And needs, satisfaction, autonomy, competence, and relatedness predicted motivation variables, and only these two paths, introjected regulation and adaptive outcomes, and external regulation and adaptive outcomes, were not significant. Yeah, it's a beautiful model, isn't it? I have one too. Okay, and interactive effects found between teachers, support, and adaptive outcomes, and the mediation proportion found was 62% through the hypothesized mediators, need satisfaction and motivation, and 97% between support from the teacher and maladaptive outcomes. And also little mediation was found between peer support and student outcomes, both to adaptive and maladaptive outcomes. Okay, so need supportive teaching motivates students through autonomy and competence, while peer influences is more strongly associated with relatedness, and which means, and by summarizing the evidence within PE context, theoretical postulates were supported, and SDT is a framework, usable framework to understand motivational process in PE, and effective interventions designed to improve in-class experiences as well as learning outcomes, such as physical activity behavior. Okay, that was phase 1. And phase 2, I'm looking at an intervention with dependent variables determined by results of systematic review. Study 2 and 3. Sorry. In study 2, I'm examining psychometric properties of the questionnaire used in Thesis, just to check that the questionnaire and the items are looking good, so I can use it in my last study when I'm analyzing the 12 months effect of the intervention that I'm looking at. So I used 1,189 students from 22 public schools in New South Wales from the RCT component of iPlay. And then I analyzed the structural validity by looking at factor loadings. I think factor loadings, they should be above 0.30 or 3, and factor correlations below 0.85. Also, I investigated internal consistency of the subscales. So the measures, because I found that evidence in PE regarding structure and involvement is scarce or is lacking, I included those when assessing students' perception of teacher behavior. So that measure has 4 items, 1 for each. autonomy support, competence, structural involvement, and controlling behavior. And student outcomes, not only affective and behavioral, such as enjoyment and effort, but also because cognitive outcomes have been studied less, I gave more attention and included 2 subscales to analyze cognitive outcomes. Concentration at providing information at a surface level, and then more in-depth information by investigating the use of learning strategies in PE. And so those are the measures. And this here we have a sample item. So students responded to a 5-point Likert scale, using the smiley faces. Okay. Good. So the questionnaire, the items showed satisfactory factor loadings. They were all above 0.3, and the lowest one was the item 16, which asks students about teacher controlling behavior, like if the teacher puts pressure on them. But I tested whether excluding that item would make the question better. It didn't, so I kept it. Discriminant validity, all the correlations except 1, they were all below 0.85. The only exception was the association or the correlation between concentration and effort. And internal consistency values by the omega coefficient, they were all above 0.7, 0.72 for the teacher behavior measure, 0.93 for enjoyment, 90 for effort, concentration 85, and use of learning strategies 73. So yes, the questionnaire looks good. So we can rely on the results that we get from the questionnaire. And that's what I'm doing in the next few months. Working on my study 3, analyzing the first year of the iPlay intervention. Pretty much the same thing, the RCT component, same schools, remaining students, looking at those measures. And yeah, that's it.
Tell me, I didn't quite understand. Did you say that there was no value in distinguishing between need satisfaction and need frustration, so that you collapsed them? Is that in the meta-analysis?
I combined because there were few correlations actually, so it reversed.
I know, I understand. You reverse scored them and put them into a single scale rather than treating them as 2 separate scales. And was that because when you treated them as separate satisfaction and frustration scales, they didn't?
Well, yeah, there wouldn't be enough correlations to run the model. So
is it similar to the SEM? Can you go back to that table with the different SEMs, and you rejected 2, and I wasn't quite sure if it relates to what you're saying. It's like one of the models assumed negative and positive.
Oops.
Where you rejected 2 models.
So this one.
You said you rejected. You said you went with one that fit in. It was somewhat fit indices, and the fit indices went way down when you left your preferred model.
Where you selected the SDT model.
And I wasn't sure what models you were rejecting. Or those other.
Okay, so I rejected this one.
But is it assuming that they were independent? Or are you saying did your model also could they have been correlated, though distinguishable factors? Because, in other words, does your model assume that these things don't correlate? None of this stuff correlates at all.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be why it would misfit.
Well,
You've got another competing model with that though, right?
yeah. Oh, with this one. Yeah, so I tested with pass from, I think I put it in the wrong model, maybe. Yeah, because I tested the one with pass from like among every variable.
But it's the one you said you rejected this model. I'm just trying to figure out what.
No, Joe, you mean the correlation between teacher support and controlling behaviour, for instance? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. Well, just is this a model that assumes there's two independent pathways, totally independent, like there's no overlap between them, there's no correlated residuals, nothing.
There's correlations between the ones at the same stage, but not going from stage 1 to stage 2. So,
Yeah,
teacher support and controlling behaviour are correlated, but not teacher support and need frustration.
Yeah, that's. Yeah, and need satisfaction, need frustration, residuals are correlated. And that doesn't fit better than, and so the alternative to that is just assuming maladaptive and adaptive are together, or?
Yeah, no, not together. So this one here, I mean, sorry. Well, yeah, so that's.
This one.
That's the one that you were talking about.
That's the one here.
Dual process, what is being rejected? I'm just not sure, maybe.
Should go to the next slide, too. Yeah.
So you're still keeping them separate. So, okay.
More, he's keeping the maladaptive and adaptive outcomes separate.
Yeah.
But he's merging the needs, the psychological needs.
So there's no need for.
So you're taking autonomy, satisfaction, and combining it with autonomy, frustration, but reverse court.
Why is that getting so much worse, that fit when?
Pardon?
That shouldn't fit very well. I mean, I'm just surprised. That should.
Well,
Okay.
so those oftentimes are very highly correlated, and so the question is how much discriminant validity you have.
Well, maybe it's the specificity of the target. Maybe that's one of the things. Like if you're talking about something very specific, like exercising or something.
I'm hesitant to jump in because Diego's done all this work himself,
Yeah.
but you've actually answered that in your response to the reviewers.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember.
I wasn't reviewer.
Yeah, and you answered it completely yourself, with nothing to do with me and Phil. So, at the heat of the moment, I think is a bit hard sometimes. But I mean, when you did that, the dual process model, right? One of the things you looked at trying to include was the need satisfaction, right, and the needs frustration, and basically the model just blew up because you had such high correlations between negative correlations between satisfaction and frustration.
Yeah.
So in the end, you had to drop those entirely from that dual process model and just look at social factors with motivation because they were so highly correlated.
And this is need satisfaction about. It's not just general in my life.
No,
About
P.
Yeah, about P. So I'm wondering if it's the domain specificity. So I'm just thinking out loud. That makes them almost overlap. Whereas if you ask about people's life in general, you get much more. Or if it was about exercise in general, maybe. Just speculating.
I was just interested because I was just working on that issue in relation to an SET article that I'm working on now, where we're looking at the discriminant validity of the 6 scales and looking at some studies. Mostly studies collapse them into either the 3 components that you've got, or into a total need satisfaction, a total need frustration. And yeah, in case I'll send you a copy of it, but it's tangential.
Is that
to what's really
exercise
good.
related?
No, it's not. It's a different domain. It's work.
Okay.
Yeah.
Surprised at that.
So your peer support variable in PE, can you just say a little bit about how people measured peer support and what that means in a PE class to have peer support?
Well,
As opposed to teacher support, which we know in a way what it means, but in a PE class, just say a little bit more about what peer support looks like.
okay. I'm not sure I quite remember the items and scales. But, well, they usually ask students about, they use the same questions, but they just change the term teacher to peer,
Yeah.
which sometimes makes sense, but sometimes
Yeah.
it doesn't. same thing.
I guess my feeling in PE classes is I could get peer support, but not for the things that are adaptive outcomes.
And weren't they showing a link with interjected though? Or wasn't there I thought I saw an effect like that, like where peer support wasn't always good. But I might have misinterpreted it.
You did have some findings about your.
I thought I saw something. Yeah, like maybe extrinsic motivation or something. I can't remember exactly.
It wasn't here because, I mean, all the effects appear positive here.
That's true.
But you did have some relationships between peer support and maladaptive outcomes. That,
Yeah, external regulation.
you were struggling to explain, which is interesting.
I just say my guess is that, you know, when you have a good group of peers in a PE class, they may not have the same agenda as the teacher. And so that the meaning of it is different in that context.
Speaking from personal experience.
I'm speculation.
The other thing that Diego's not saying in this is this meta-analysis was so huge that he has another meta-analysis in the discussion of randomized control trials that consists of 4 lines, but has how many effect sizes? Was it about
16, 23 from 16 studies.
So, you know, it's not bad when you've got a meta-analysis of that size as a sentence in your discussion.
Okay, I think we're done.
Thank you.